Good evening. At the end of the second evening of the conference, we're going to hold a conversation with senior researchers of INSS, and especially to answer questions of the viewers. We have with us General Amos Yadlin, the head of INSS, and Ms. Sima, a senior researcher. Good evening. In a comprehensive view, when the world order is changing in front of our eyes and the competition among the nations is accelerating, Amos, what is the policy of Israel within the superpowers? Some people say that Israel is walking on the razor's edge and that it should take sides. I think Israel did already in the first 50 years. And this is not something that's going to change. Israel took a choice by choosing the United States of America. The U.S. is the strategic ally and friend of Israel, both in security, in diplomacy. And as opposed to that, in the first 45 years of the state, Russia and China, which are the other superpowers, not always did we have diplomatic relations with them, and many times they identified with our enemies. Long onions and good partner, with attention to what the United States is saying about the connections of security or things that jeopardize the security of the United States, and Russia, which is not an enemy but also not an ally. There are operative coordination mechanisms that prevent a clash that neither of us wants to get to. Sima, in this connection, what actually do the superpowers want? Where are they striving to in the Iranian nuclear deal? Look, we have a new administration in the United States, President Biden, and the team that already consolidated. They declared before the elections, and I think they mean it, they want to go back to the nuclear deal. There are conditions. It's not that they're jumping into the pool. There's an understanding of what happened in the last 5.5 years. Russia and China want to see the United States go back without many words, supporting the Iranian stand, which actually says this is a deal, we did it in the past, we negotiated, there's no point in opening it again, every side knows what exactly they have to do, we're ready for it, and the United States should do the same. I think the United States, on the one hand, has Europe that understands that there's a change in the situation, but Russia and China are not there. So when the superpowers and the United States are considering to go back to the nuclear deal, to renew negotiations, we heard the Chief of Staff that the JCPOA of 2015, even with improvements, is a bad thing, it's wrong, and it shouldn't be enabled. Amos, what do you think about these words of the Chief of Staff? How were they received in the States? First of all, I want to thank the Chief of Staff for the comprehensive talk he gave us in the opening evening. He gave us a survey of all the arenas. He talked about the IDF, about exerting force, war between the wars, very important remarks that didn't come to the media regarding the combat field. What about proportionality? And I think that we have to pay attention to that. But the criticism on what he said focused about the nuclear deal. And I think that the Chief of Staff actually said to what deal we should not go back. And on that, there's a consensus in the Israeli political system that the 2015 deal is a bad one. I think that what he said regarding what we shouldn't go back to derived from the fact that there was no discussion about what should be in it. And maybe there his statement, but wasn't that great. He said a few amendments that are not clear exactly. I think there are some amendments that are clear, some amendments that we have to make if we want the agreement or the deal will be the solution for the Iranian nuclear, but on that he chose not to talk. And how was this received in the States? Look, I think that the State of Israel has to dialogue very importantly with the United States about the policy policy vis-à-vis Iran. We have a new administration in the States. I wrote an article, so happens today, that a colleague from Abu Dhabi, we wrote it together in the strategic estimate that I will present tomorrow in the conference. There are very clear statements what Israel can do, and these statements also say to America, friends, going back to 2015 is not a good thing. It's wrong. Should it have been said by the chief of staff or by a political personality? We don't know. We don't know. It was coordinated with the government, but it was important to the chief of staff that America will know that the professional echelon that in the past was considered as an echelon that had more positive thoughts about the 2015 deal. Today, his opinion is that it's very problematic, and all the assumptions that we're very optimistic about how Iran is going to conduct itself, how more moderate people are going to be there, how the Middle East will not continue with terror. All these things did not happen. The weapons that we found out about, so the chief of staff said professionally that this deal is not good for Israel. So when you look at it from Tel Aviv, what do they say about Tehran? Well, immediately they reacted to what he said, and I want to add that the chief of staff not only said this, he also explained what he directed the IDF to do, and he connected it to the option of military attack. And Iran immediately reacted. It said Israel hasn't capability, hasn't got a plan. If they do anything, we'll burn Tel Aviv. And they also said that it's psychological warfare. And Israel should understand that in the White House there's a new president. He doesn't receive directions from Israel. That's the senior people, the spokesman of the government immediately reacted. They didn't even think twice. I think that we have to remember that Iran, throughout the years, already knows the situation where it is. On the one hand, the Americans are negotiating in one way or another. They're ready for it, and Israel is threatening with attack. We were there in 2012. We know it. Is it true to do or good to do it today is a question that I personally would say it's preferable to negotiate with the United States quietly, without exposing it, without clarifying what's good, what's not good. This administration is 10 days old, and already Israel is telling them what to do. I personally don't think it's the right thing to do. It's obvious that today, more than we knew in 2015, that in this agreement there are a few things that have to be changed, that even this administration understands it. What did Biden said? Biden said, I'm going to go back in order to negotiate the next deal. And the problem is that it's not clear whether he's taking off all the sanctions. How does he obligate Iran to sit down to a new negotiation? How do you connect between going back to the deal and the Iranian obligation to go to an improved one? So the sanctions are actually the leverage that will enable America to get improvements. What improvements do we need to this deal that it will be accepted by Israel and will be considered a good deal? First of all, I think we have to understand the tension in which the Americans are when they are now consolidating this program, between their will to go back to the diplomatic channels up to getting to the deal, and their understanding that the deal is not good and they have to keep leverages. And that's why I think that the right way, first of all, is to go back to JCPOA minus, some sort of a stalemate, vis-a-vis stalemate, Dennis Ross's idea of less for less, and still that will be a leverage there that Trump gave them against the Iranians in order to amend and to get a JCPOA plus. So what has to be amended? First of all, the sunset. We are now approaching it. We don't want to be there. In this deal, at the end, the Iranians have legitimacy to a full nuclear problem. Zero distance from a bomb. And that's not said by Netanyahu. It was said by Obama. They do not have approval to make a bomb, as Netanyahu says. But they do have the possibility to break through to a bomb in such a short time that it won't be able to be stopped. The other thing, we need better cards. This deal allowed the Iranians to evade the supervision. There's also the potential military dimension of the Iranian activity, of the campaign of the Mossad that brought over very interesting material from the archives of Iran. It's not archives, it's actually a warehouse of weapons. They are the basis of any deal. Before they went to the deal, the IAEA gave Iran a clear slate, and we have to go back to look at it. And in fact, I think that we have to go back and to look at the deal and to tie all the knots. And I think that the Americans understand that. Sima, is it possible that the Iranians are going to accept all these demands without the pressure of the sanctions? Because it seems that Biden perhaps is not interested to continue with the sanctions. Look, the Iranians, first of all, I think they're desperate to come to the negotiation table in order to get away from the sanctions. There's no question that the economic situation in Iran, together with the coronavirus, is a situation that they are dying for a deal. First of all, we should take advantage of this. It doesn't mean we have to continue, because Biden said he's not going to continue in Trump's way. But definitely, there's some sort of a situation that enables Iran to negotiate from a strong point of view. And it's important that the administration do it. The second thing, Iran explained that there's no scenario of negotiation on this deal. This is a deal that was done 5 years ago with the international superpowers. It's not just the US, it's also Europe and Russia and China. This is the position that they presented. And 3 days ago also in an article in the American media, and they said loud and clear, no negotiation again, only backing from the sanctions, and also the sanctions that already started materialized. And that's the worst. Last October, the whole issue of embargo on weapons to Iran is off. In 23, the embargo on missiles is gone. Zarif said, this is it. So I agree with Amos. The American administration has a commitment that it created to go back to the deal. But on the other hand, they understand that they have to create some basis to continue, not to go back to where we were before. It's very complicated. So it's going to take some time. It's not easy. I just want to say that next June there are elections in Iran for the next president. Next president definitely will be a conservative and more radical. And therefore, Iran, within 2 months, is going to a situation that it's going to have election campaign. It's not democracy, but still, they have election campaigns. So the timetable is very short. And the Americans, including Biden, they're saying, we proved at the time of Trump that the United States alone, without the entire world, can exert very extensive sanctions, and Iran will not agree. We know how to bring them back to the table. We have the capability. You said, Sima, actually talked about the risks with the years of JCPOA, and those risks that will come later. After the first delay, we compared it at the time to the dream of Pharaoh. 7 good years, 7 bad years, and they're so bad that maybe they'll forget the good beforehand. So we understand that improvements in the deal at the moment is not the first priority of Iran, but there were other threats on the part of Iran in missiles and the proxies in the area. Amos, what's the way, not through the deal itself, to grapple with these threats? Israel is grappling well with threats that are not nuclear. The war between wars is proving it. The only threat that has the potential to be existential on Israel is the nuclear threat. If you want to get to a deal with all the things, of course, it's going to fail. This is a strategy to somebody who doesn't want a deal. But what we have to ensure is the fact that there is a nuclear deal does not prevent the activity against the Iranian conduct, the aggressiveness, the negative. What happened during Obama? Wanting to maintain the nuclear deal and not to upset the Iranians, they stopped all other activities against the other things they did. Israel as well, and the United States have to understand that you can detach the things, but then you have to act against the Iranian activities. I think that our new allies in the Gulf areas, this is something very important, that we are going to act against the undermining of stability in the Middle East of Iran. In other words, we're actually hear from you that you have to cope parallel with two things. One may be agreements, the other may be exerting force. In the context of exerting force, like in the war game simulation that we held today, actually we saw the parties trying to exert force and to walk on edge and not to go to war. But walking on both sides, it's a bit dangerous. The parties in the past maybe acted with some logic, but we think after the simulation game, Tzipi Livni and Gadi Eisenkot said, with such danger to Israel, then how can the government accept it? It's not reasonable. You hear in the security system, maybe there'll be just a few days of battle. Is that possible, to just have a few days of battle and not a real war? You mentioned the simulation. I enacted Iran, and because the main goal of Iran is to avoid its attack, and it's doing everything through proxies and other territories, not from Iran itself. It's obvious that the Iranians are going to do whatever they can in order to ensure that after they reacted, and this is a reaction, it's not an initiative, this is reactions against them. The first thing they'll try to do is to ensure that they're not attacked. So the simulation, they conveyed a message to the Americans that Iran ended the account. Israel also has a dilemma in this context. First of all, it doesn't come from Iran, and Israel doesn't have an interest to wage war against Iran. So the reactions of Israel can also be very far-fetching, but not to get into the territory of Iran, because the moment we attack within Iran, some people say it's an opportunity, let's attack the Iranian deal. We don't go on such a big thing with such significances just by the way. There's an opportunity. It doesn't work that way. If you want to attack the Iranian deal, do it. But it's not just like that because there was some attack in Abu Dhabi. I think that Israel definitely is in a situation that it'll have to react, for sure. It has to, but it's not going to do it just like that. And this walking on a razor's edge, everybody's doing it. Hezbollah also doesn't want to put Lebanon in a war. Iran doesn't want a war on its territory, and neither does Israel. So on this razor's edge, you need some responsible entity like the US or Russia. You need some responsible adults to take care. So we're talking about negotiations with a credible military option and the attempt of all the parties not to get to war. That's what's happening. To what extent do you think that this is working? I think that this strategy is very significant, and it shows, you said maybe it's not possible, but I think that what's happening, both between Israel and Iran regarding the nuclear, and also between Israel and Iran regarding Syria, and Israel and Hezbollah, and Hamas. There are capabilities of inclusion and containment and preventing escalation, because there's a big gap of capabilities between. Today, nobody wants to get to war. War today has very heavy prices, and the chance to have strategic edges from there, it's very limited. So the system today is more stable than it was. As for the war between wars, it's a great success. I think that what Qasem Soleimani planned, that he got to Syria in 2021, capabilities of precise missiles and Shiite militias from all over. Hezbollah is duplicating itself on the border of the Golan Heights. All this didn't happen. However, on the other hand, the Iranians are still in Syria, and there are certain areas there of aerial defense that I think the Iranians are based there, and the war between wars did not manage to uproot them. You mentioned the precise missiles, and we keep hearing about cases of missiles falling in Saudi Arabia. One of the viewers, Noor Dahari, who's the head of the Islamic Theology Center in Britain, in view of these attacks on the Gulf countries and on Israel, how actually will the Gulf countries react towards Iran? What about the Abraham Accords? Do they change anything? No question that these accords are changing the situation. Look, there are two things. First of all, the legitimacy that Israel is getting in the Arab world. For Iran, that's very negative. And the second thing is the feeling of Iran that not only Iran is on Syria and Lebanon, but now Israel is very close to the Iranian border. So I would say that this is something in general. When do we come to the nitty-gritty, these countries, the last thing they want or willing that Israel will act from their territory towards Iran. They're afraid of Iran, justifiably so. They say that Iran has weapons from the 70s, 80s, and they have an American sophisticated weapon still. Definitely, Iran is a regional superpower, so we are in the middle of all this, between a very great achievements, intelligence, strategy, image, but the realization of a real campaign is very complicated. So the Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, if there's something they don't want, is to have a straight fight with Iran. Some of them already signed the normalization agreements with Israel. When and are we to expect additional agreements with Qatar, Saudi Arabia? Not by chance, it didn't happen till now. The Saudi Arabians have a very severe problem in the United States. We see it every day again in the Congress, in this specific administration. The Saudis don't know how to. The one who is going to be appointed the head of the DNI, Avril Haines, she already said that she's going to publish the reports regarding the murder of the journalist by Saudis. And we know from leaks that there's pinpointing directly to Saudi Arabia. It's a big problem. Maybe in a certain moment they'll decide that Israel can be a trump card that can help it. Maybe yes, maybe we'll help them anyway, even without formal relations. But I'm not sure this is going to be enough. Therefore, I think that Saudi Arabia is in a very sensitive, problematic situation. It's trying to feel, to check where it can act. Qatar is in the best place. It gives money for Israel to the Hamas. It also has Al Jazeera that keeps attacking Israel and what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And it is a wonderful relations with Iran. And now, because of the pressure of Trump, it went back to the group of the Gulf countries and it can fly over their territory. So it managed, because of its economic capability and also the capability to manage relations simultaneously with the two sides, it managed to locate itself in a very good place, and it's not afraid to have agreements with Israel. It gets all the benefits from it. What Sima now said about the Gulf countries, she also mentioned Palestinians. Maybe before this was the issue. Amos, to what extent the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still central in the region and the stability of the region? I think that the region understood that the Palestinian issue, as opposed to the claim that this is the heart of the matter, that all the problems, these are all the problems in the Middle East is the Palestinians. Let's say a miracle happens and the Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to go to Ramallah and sign an agreement with Abu Mazen. What will change in the civil war in Syria? What will change in the civil war in Libya? What's happening in Iraq? The humanitarian disaster in Yemen? Everybody understands that the Palestinian issue is important, but it's not the central issue. And this is the reason that the Gulf countries said enough. We are captives. We gave a veto to the Palestinians. We want to advance with Israel joint interests, especially that the U.S. is leaving the Middle East, or is perceived as such. And we're saying to the Palestinians, you're no longer going to be with a veto on our relations with Israel. It doesn't mean that they accepted the Israeli position regarding the Palestinians. But I think that the Palestinians will do the right thing if they understand that they can no longer get automatic support from the Arab world. On the contrary, they have to leverage the good relations that created now in a warm peace with the Emirates, and to understand together the Arabs, the Israelis, the Americans, and the Palestinians who made the Abraham Accords together in order to try to advance the processes that will diminish the conflict of the Israeli Palestinians, will create a basis, maybe not today, but tomorrow, for the solution of the two states. We actually now, in a very short discussion, we moved quickly from the world order and the superpowers, then Iran, with all the threats. We went to the normalization agreements with the Emirates, and we ended with the Palestinian issue. And for many people, maybe it's less important, but for Israel, these are our close neighbors. I'd like to thank Sima and Amos for their participation and contribution and the insights. I wish to thank the people who sent the questions and all the people watching us from home who were with us today. And see you tomorrow, 5:30 p.m., the third evening of the conference of INSS.